In the beautiful land of Assam, with its green fields and flowing rivers, a deep fear started to grow. This was not a fear of snakes or tigers, but a fear that people had about their homes and their future. For many years, people from neighboring areas, especially from what is now Bangladesh, had been coming to Assam. They came looking for land to farm and a new life for their families. At first, this was not a big problem, but over time, the number of new people grew larger and larger. The local people of Assam started to worry. They felt that their land, their culture, and their language were in danger. This worry was not just a feeling. It was something people could see every day. The local Assamese communities, including tribal groups like the Tiwa people, saw that the new settlers were taking up more and more land. They felt that the government was not doing enough to protect their rights. The new people spoke a different language, Bengali, and had different customs. The Assamese people feared they would become a minority in their own homeland. This fear turned into anger, an anger that grew slowly but steadily, like a river rising during the monsoon rains. It was a feeling that their identity was being washed away. The problem was about more than just land. It was about who belonged in Assam. The local communities had lived there for generations. They had their own unique traditions, festivals, and ways of life. When so many new people arrived, it felt like their world was changing too fast. They worried that their children would not learn the Assamese language or know their history. This created a feeling of us versus them. The new arrivals were seen not as neighbors, but as foreigners or outsiders. This division created a lot of tension and suspicion between the different communities living side by side. This fear and anger did not appear overnight. It was built up over many decades, passed down from parents to children. People felt that their voices were not being heard by the leaders in Delhi. They believed that the government was allowing more people to come in because they wanted their votes in elections. This made the local people feel betrayed and powerless. They felt they had to do something to protect their land and their culture before it was too late. This deep-seated anxiety was the fertile ground where the seeds of a massive conflict were sown, waiting for a trigger to sprout into violence. The growing anger in Assam finally burst into a big protest movement. It was called the Assam Movement, or the Assam Agitation. This movement started in the late 1970s and was led mainly by students. The All Assam Students' Union, or AASU, was at the forefront, along with other groups that formed a coalition called the All Assam Gana Sangram Parishad, or AGSP. Their main demand was simple and clear. They wanted the government to find the illegal immigrants, whom they called foreigners, and send them back. They wanted to protect Assam's unique identity, culture, and resources for the local people. The movement was huge and involved people from all walks of life. Students boycotted their classes, government workers went on strike, and ordinary people joined marches and protests. They held rallies, blocked roads, and stopped the flow of oil from Assam to the rest of India. They wanted to get the attention of the central government in New Delhi. Their slogan was, "Detect, delete, deport." This meant they wanted the government to find the names of illegal immigrants on the voter lists, remove them, and then send them out of the country. The protests were mostly peaceful at first, but the anger was very strong. As the movement grew, the atmosphere in Assam became very tense. The protests created a deep divide between the Assamese-speaking people and the Bengali-speaking communities, especially the Muslims. The leaders of the movement spoke about protecting their homeland from being taken over by outsiders. While they said their fight was not against any religion, their words often made the Bengali-speaking Muslims feel targeted and unsafe. These people, many of whom had lived in Assam for generations, were now being labeled as foreigners. They feared for their lives and their homes, caught in a conflict that was not of their making. The leaders of the Assam movement became very powerful. They had the support of millions of Assamese people who felt that their concerns were finally being heard. The movement continued for 6 long years, bringing normal life in the state to a standstill. The government tried to talk to the student leaders many times, but they could not agree on a solution. The students wanted all immigrants who came after 1951 to be sent back. But the government had a different cutoff year in mind. This disagreement created a deadlock, and as time went on, the anger and frustration on both sides only grew deeper and more dangerous. After years of protests and talks that went nowhere, the central government, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, made a decision that would have terrible consequences. In early 1983, she decided to hold state elections in Assam. The leaders of the Assam movement were completely against this. They argued that the elections should not happen until the issue of foreigners was solved. They said the voter lists were full of names of illegal immigrants, and holding an election with those lists would be unfair. It would give political power to the very people they were protesting against. The AASU and other movement leaders called for a complete boycott of the elections. They warned everyone not to vote and threatened anyone who tried to file nomination papers to run for office. They believed the election was a trick by the government to ignore their demands and crush their movement. They told the people of Assam that participating in this election would be a betrayal of their cause. The call for a boycott was very strong, and it created a climate of fear and intimidation across the state. The stage was set for a major confrontation. Despite the widespread opposition and clear warnings of violence, the government decided to go ahead with the elections. They sent thousands of police and paramilitary forces to Assam to ensure the polls could take place. This decision was like throwing a match into a room full of gasoline. It made the situation much worse. The movement leaders and their supporters felt that the government was using force to silence them. The atmosphere became filled with anger and hate. Inflammatory speeches were made by some political leaders, further dividing communities and encouraging violence against those labeled as foreigners. The decision to hold the election was the final spark that ignited the simmering tensions. For the supporters of the Assam movement, anyone who participated in the election, whether by voting or by standing as a candidate, was seen as a traitor. For the Bengali-speaking communities, especially the Muslims, the election offered a chance to have their voices heard and to protect their rights. They felt they had to vote to prove they were citizens. This disagreement over the election created a direct conflict. It pitted neighbor against neighbor, and tragically, it paved the way for one of the most brutal massacres in India's history. The morning of February 18, 1983, began like any other day in the villages around Nellie, a small town in central Assam. But this day would end in unimaginable horror. A huge mob, thousands of people strong, gathered with a single, terrible purpose. The mob was made up of local villagers, mostly from the Tiwa tribal community, and some Assamese Hindus. They were armed with whatever they could find, sharp farming tools like machetes, spears, and some had old guns. They were angry about the election and believed the people in the nearby villages were foreigners who were voting against their wishes. The targets of their anger were the Bengali-speaking Muslims living in a cluster of 14 villages, including Nellie, Alisinga, and Basundari. The attackers came from all sides, surrounding the villages so that no one could escape. They shouted slogans against foreigners and began their brutal assault. The attack was not a spontaneous burst of anger. It was planned. The mobs moved from one village to the next with terrifying efficiency. They set fire to the simple huts made of bamboo and thatch. As people ran out of their burning homes, they were attacked and killed. The violence was swift and merciless. In just 6 hours, from around 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, a wave of death swept through the area. The villagers, who were mostly poor farmers, had no way to defend themselves against the armed mobs. They ran in panic, trying to hide in the fields or escape across the nearby river. But there was nowhere to go. The attackers chased them down and killed them without mercy. The air was filled with the screams of the dying, the cries of children, and the smoke from the burning houses. By the time the violence ended, the green fields of Nellie were stained red with blood. An entire community was destroyed in a matter of hours. The attackers left behind a scene of absolute devastation. The official count said that over 2,000 people were killed, but many believe the real number was much higher, perhaps as many as 10,000. It was a massacre of shocking scale and cruelty. What happened on that day was not a riot or a clash between two groups. It was a one-sided slaughter of defenseless men, women, and children. The victims of the Nellie massacre were, just ordinary people who had done nothing wrong. They were farmers, fishermen, and laborers who were simply trying to live a peaceful life. But the attackers, they did not see them as people at all. They saw them only as so-called foreigners who needed to be removed. The greatest suffering, sadly, was borne by the most vulnerable, the women and children. Eyewitnesses later described absolutely horrific scenes of mothers trying desperately to protect their babies, only to be killed along with them. Children were snatched from their parents' arms and brutally murdered. The cruelty was just beyond imagination. Survivors who somehow managed to escape told stories of unimaginable loss. They saw their family members being hacked to death right in front of their eyes. They lost their parents, their children, their husbands, and their wives. One survivor remembered hiding in a bush and watching as his entire village was burned to the ground. He heard the screams of his friends and neighbors, but was just too terrified to move. Many who survived the initial attack were badly injured, with deep cuts from sharp weapons. They were left with physical scars and deep emotional wounds that would never fully heal. The attackers showed no mercy whatsoever. They did not spare the elderly or even the very young. In the aftermath, journalists and relief workers found bodies scattered everywhere, in the fields, in the rivers, and inside the charred remains of homes. The scale of the killing was so large that it was difficult to even count all the dead. For those who survived, everything was gone. Their homes were destroyed. Their belongings were looted or burned, and their families were, just torn apart. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the terrible memories of what they had witnessed. In the midst of all this horror, there were really very few who could help. The victims were completely isolated and unprotected. The attackers had come in such large numbers that any resistance was just impossible. The people of Nellie and the surrounding villages were left to face the fury of the mob all alone. The suffering of that day was immense, a dark stain on the history of Assam. It showed how political anger and hatred, when directed at a defenseless community, can unfortunately lead to the most horrific acts of violence against innocent human beings. One of the most tragic parts of the Nellie story is that the massacre could have been prevented. The government and the local police knew that the situation in Assam was extremely dangerous. They knew that holding an election against the will of so many people would lead to violence. Senior police officials had warned the government that they did not have enough forces to protect everyone, especially in remote villages. One top police officer, KPS Gill, had even suggested holding the elections in phases to manage the security better, but his advice was ignored. The government seemed determined to push through the election at any cost. On the day of the massacre, the police were almost nowhere to be seen. There were reports that the local police station near Nellie had been informed that a large armed mob was gathering, yet little was done to stop them. Some accounts suggest that security forces like the Central Reserve Police Force were deliberately diverted away from the area, leaving the villagers completely exposed to the attackers. The few policemen who were present were either unwilling or unable to confront the massive mob. Their inaction allowed the killers to carry out their terrible plan without any interference. When the violence was finally over, the police and army arrived, but it was far too late. They came to a scene of death and destruction. Their job was no longer to protect the living, but to count the dead. The government's response in the immediate aftermath was slow and inadequate. Survivors were left without food, water, or shelter. They were herded into makeshift relief camps that were overcrowded and lacked basic facilities. For the people who had lost everything, this felt like a second betrayal. First, the government failed to protect them from the killers, and then it failed to care for them in their time of greatest need. The failure of the government and police was not just a matter of incompetence. Many felt it was deliberate. The attackers were supporters of the Assam movement, and there was a feeling that some in the local administration and police sympathized with their cause. This created a situation where the state, which is supposed to protect all its citizens equally, stood by while a minority community was slaughtered. This complete breakdown of law and order remains one of the most shameful aspects of the Nellie massacre, a terrible example of what happens when the protectors fail to do their duty. In the days and weeks after the massacre, the full extent of the horror became clear. The official death toll was placed at 2,191, but everyone knew the real number was much higher. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They were housed in temporary relief camps where they lived in terrible conditions. These camps became home to nearly 300,000 people who had been displaced by the violence across Assam. For the survivors of Nellie, the camps were places of grief and despair. They mourned their dead and worried about their future, with no homes to return to and no means to support themselves. The government filed hundreds of criminal cases against the people believed to have taken part in the massacre. In total, 688 cases were registered, and charge sheets were filed in more than 300 of them. This gave the survivors a small glimmer of hope that they might one day see justice. They hoped that the people who had killed their families would be punished for their crimes. However, this hope was soon extinguished. The legal process was slow and complicated. The survivors were traumatized and afraid to testify against their attackers, who were often their own neighbors. The search for justice ultimately came to a heartbreaking end. As part of a political agreement to bring peace to Assam, all the cases related to the Nellie massacre were dropped. This decision was made to help the state move on from the years of conflict. But for the victims, it was a devastating blow. It meant that not a single person would ever be held accountable for the killing of thousands of innocent people. No one was ever punished, and no one ever went to jail. The promise of justice was sacrificed for the sake of political peace. This lack of justice left a deep and lasting wound in the hearts of the survivors and their community. They felt that their lives and their suffering did not matter. The memory of the massacre was something they had to carry alone, without any sense of closure or accountability from the state. The physical wounds may have healed over time, but the emotional and psychological scars remained. The failure to deliver justice for Nellie created a legacy of bitterness and distrust that would continue to affect the politics of Assam for many years to come. After 6 long years of protests and the horrific violence of 1983, everyone agreed that something had to be done to bring peace back to Assam. In 1985, 2 years after the Nellie massacre, a historic agreement was signed. It was called the Assam Accord. The accord was signed by the central government, led by the new Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, the state government of Assam, and the leaders of the Assam movement, the AASU and AAGSP. The main goal of the accord was to address the issue of foreigners that had caused so much conflict and bloodshed in the state. The Assam Accord had several key points. The most important was the agreement on a cutoff date to identify immigrants. It was decided that anyone who came to Assam from Bangladesh after March 24, 1971, would be considered an illegal immigrant. These people were to be detected and deported. For those who had arrived between 1966 and 1971, their names would be removed from the voting lists for 10 years, but they could stay in India. This was a compromise. The movement leaders had wanted an earlier date, but they agreed to this to end the agitation. The signing of the accord was seen as a major victory for the Assam movement. It was a promise from the government to protect the culture, language, and identity of the Assamese people. As part of the agreement, the leaders of the movement agreed to call off their protests and help restore normalcy to the state. They then formed a new political party called the Assam Gana Parishad. In the state elections held in December 1985, the AGP won a huge victory, and the student leaders who had led the movement became the new leaders of the Assam government. However, the Assam Accord also had a painful side. To create a peaceful future, it included a provision to withdraw all pending criminal cases related to the agitation. This meant that the cases filed for the Nellie massacre were all dropped. While the accord brought an end to the widespread protests, it denied justice to the thousands of victims of the violence. For the survivors of Nellie, the peace came at a very high price. The accord closed a chapter of conflict in Assam's history, but it also closed the door on any hope for accountability for one of the worst massacres the country had ever seen. Today, more than 4 decades after the terrible events of February 18, 1983, the Nellie massacre remains a deep and painful scar on the land and people of Assam. It is a dark chapter that is often spoken about in hushed tones, a memory that many would rather forget. But for the survivors and their descendants, forgetting is not an option. The massacre continues to shape their lives and their identity. It serves as a constant and chilling reminder of how quickly political tensions over land, language, and identity can explode into deadly violence against the innocent. The legacy of Nellie is still very much alive in the politics of Assam. The questions that fueled the Assam movement, who is a citizen, who is a foreigner, and who belongs in Assam, are still being debated today. The Assam Accord led to the creation of the National Register of Citizens in the state, a massive exercise to identify genuine Indian citizens and weed out illegal immigrants. This process has been controversial and has left nearly 2 million people, mostly Bengali-speaking Muslims, facing an uncertain future, at risk of being declared stateless in the country they call home. The massacre is remembered today as a symbol of two things: extreme brutality and complete injustice. It is a story of how a community was targeted and slaughtered while the state failed to protect them. It is also a story of how the legal system failed to punish a single perpetrator for their crimes. Documentaries like What the Fields Remember and the work of journalists and historians have helped keep the memory of Nellie alive, ensuring that the victims are not forgotten. These efforts remind us of the human cost of hate and the importance of remembering history to avoid repeating it. Remembering Nellie is not about reopening old wounds. It is about learning from the past. It teaches us a powerful lesson about the dangers of dehumanizing others and the responsibility of a government to protect all its citizens, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. The fields of Nellie may be green again, but they hold a story of immense sorrow. It is a story that India must never forget, a reminder that peace and justice must always walk hand in hand. The silent graves of Nellie continue to cry out for remembrance and for a promise that such a tragedy will never happen again.